I think the IPF is going to fall off. And I think the USAPL is making the right move. And if you are a lifter who's unsure of which way to go, I strongly think all lifters should go with the USAPL and not with the IPF affiliate. Now, I've talked to many lifters who don't agree with me on this, and with all due respect, I think their reasoning is a little bit weak. But before I begin, Gaston, the president of the IPF, has wished me happy birthday every single year since 2013 on Facebook. I may not get that this year. I just got to deal with that emotionally. I just got to accept that I'm going to cut this off. The IPF has just unacceptable drug testing. It really is to the point to where I don't know if you can be an ambassador of powerlifting, if drug-tested powerlifting, and defend the IPF in this circumstance. I mean, in 2019, I've mentioned this on a video before, but let me repeat it now. In 2019, Japan, which is a top 5 country consistently in raw bench, in equipped worlds as well, and even in junior worlds, they had 1 drug test in 2019. And they are a nation with the funds to have drug testing. This was before any COVID lockdowns. And they had 1 drug test in the entire country. That's pathetic. That's inexcusable. You shouldn't be allowed to be an IPF country with 1 drug test. And the reason why the USAPL is splitting off is because they did additional drug testing that wasn't WADA approved and wasn't as expensive. So they basically did their own WADA testing that they kind of had to do, but then they also added additional tests. So they're not allowed to add additional tests. They actually have to do less drug testing to stay in with the IPF. And I just don't think that's a problem you can overlook. That is an immense fairness issue. I mean, you're saying in multiple countries, you can just use steroids as much as you want. There were many countries with literally 0 drug tests, and they're still an IPF affiliate. You should just not be allowed to be an IPF affiliate at that point. To me, that's so crystal clear. But then the second point is there's also an issue of parity at Worlds. And I think this issue is going to get worse and worse over time. It already has. The US has won, I believe, the last 5+ Classic Worlds. And they've won by far. And actually, USAPL Nationals recently has become more competitive than IPF Worlds. Now, there are some weight classes where this isn't totally true. I do want to be clear on that. Guys like Calgary Barbell, obviously, Bryce from Calgary Barbell, he's obviously a fantastic lifter. Canadian powerlifters in general are fantastic. They do a pretty damn good job at drug testing too. Canada is the best example of an IPF affiliate that does it right. Hold up. This is right at the point where I decided, let's dig a little bit deeper. So I'm going to do my own stats. What I did is I looked at the amount of drug tests by nation, and then also looked at the number of active lifters in open powerlifting in 2019 specifically. So I'm keeping this to 2019 to avoid any issues with COVID-19 lockdowns, of course. So when looking at this, it was actually quite fascinating between Canada and the United States. Those countries are going to be the most similar location-wise, competitiveness, and culturally. Canada drug tested 160 lifters out of 3,240 total lifters. The United States, on the other hand, drug tested 3,110 lifters out of 16,491 lifters, which means Canada drug tested 4.9% versus the USAPL's 18.9%. This was absolutely huge for me when making this video because I came into this not knowing which side I would take. Like, there was a time where I literally talked to Sean Noriega, like, you know, is now the time to hop over to that IPF federation? Since you guys know I've had issues with the USAPL in the past. But this was very impressive. I mean, this is what it had to be in order for their stance to make sense. Also, if you look at their out-of-competition drug tests, it's 3.1% for the US versus 1.8% for Canada. So there's really no area where Canada has the advantage other than blood tests. And on the issue of blood tests, I actually found this to be quite fascinating because I did bring that up to USAPL. But I won't get to that just yet. I want to get to the specific numbers because also an interesting thing is the exact percentage of countries that don't drug test is 45%. 45% of IPF nations do 0 drug testing. I feel like I can't repeat that enough.
0.
So nearly half of the entire federation is not a drug-tested federation in terms of countries. that was mind-blowing to me. But again, the more interesting thing is comparing some of these countries against each other is even the UK, which is very similar, I would imagine, to the US culturally and how they would approach this. They have, other than the fact that obviously they can't do the non-WADA test or else they'll get kicked out as well. The UK has 2.5% drug testing. And Italy, for example, has 2.8%, Austria 6.4%, Spain 3.4%. So what you see here is there's a significant amount of variance within European countries. And even then, it's still, in my opinion, not high enough. And again, let me bring it back to Japan, and then even Ireland also only had 5 drug tests in all of 2019. So Japan had 1, Ireland had 5. So those are both very economically successful countries with under 1% of their population drug tested. Now, that being said, there are some countries who did a phenomenal job. Finland is at 10.6%, Norway is at 16.4%, and Germany is at 15.7% with a very high population of 2,577 active lifters. So I actually contacted the German president and asked him, do they receive taxpayer funding to help make this possible? Like, what do they do differently when the UK has 2.5% and they have 15.7%? And he did tell me that they do receive government funding. So that is also very important because, again, when we're talking about what's the most logical step for United States federations, we will never get government funding, most likely, for powerlifting, nor do I honestly think we should. I don't think it's really worth throwing hard-earned taxpayer money at just a sport I enjoy, personally. But it's a good proof of concept that you can't make it happen exactly the way the USAPL is claiming if you are using WADA tests with the expenses that come with that without taxpayer money with a significant percentage of your population drug tested. Also, I want to give a shout out to Denmark with 21.6% of their population drug tested. So that is why the title of this video says, if you are a United States lifter, you should not compete in IPF. I don't even think you should support it. Now, this brings me to my interesting dilemma, is what should a European lifter do? Or when it comes to my channel, only 36% of my channel is from the US, by the way. So I'm very cognizant of that. I don't want to just have a extreme American bias here. I think you have to ask yourself, what do you value? Because does it bother you that there is a really drastic unfairness? And one of the things that really bothers me is if you look at the top 3 countries at Worlds, you're talking number 1 is the US with 18.9% drug tested. Number 2 was Russia with only 2.8% drug tests. And then Algeria with exactly 0% drug tests. So Algeria got top 3 and Denmark was 30th. I don't know. I don't know if that would bother you if you're a lifter from Denmark, that you're subjected to radically different conditions. To some people, maybe it wouldn't because they see that, hey, these are different situations and all of that. So if the only federation you have in your country is an IPF affiliate, your country's in that 10 to 20% testing range, I think it makes sense to just keep lifting. But, it's just one of those things. As far as going to Worlds and competing against people who may not be drug tested whatsoever.
But at the end of the day, you can do whatever the fuck you want to do.
Now, another point I want to talk about is the effectiveness of the test. Bryce of Calgary Barbell, who I showed earlier, he asked me directly to ask this to the USAPL president, which I did. So luckily they gave me some insider information, and we'll go over a few points that I find are pretty interesting. Is first of all, they do not blood test in the USAPL right now. Now, I was always for blood tests. As you guys know, when I had Ashton Ruska on my channel, I asked if he is for blood tests. But I will say, to be as objective as possible, I asked Ashton if he's ever been blood tested. And the answer to that is no, only urinalysis. So I'll give credit to Canada for having the highest amount of blood tests out of all countries. Now, a fascinating point the USAPL brought up to me is that the IPF has been doing blood tests and they've caught 0 people. They have 0 positives. So I looked at the 2019 drug testing report and it was 359 blood tests with 0 positives. That was surprising to me. I thought it would be more effective. To get a similar sample size of urine tests, I compared the past 3 years of Canada's urine tests. It was actually quite fascinating. 1 in 19 drug tests were positive. That was much higher than I expected. Now, to be fair, it has been improving significantly lately. I think it was just that Kelly Branton era weighing them down. Because in 2019, Canada was one failure out of every 61 drug tests. That's consistent with Denmark being one failure in every 43 urine tests, in Germany being one failure out of every 38 urine tests. So remember, the point here is the effectiveness of urine tests. And all of these countries blood test as well, and still found zero. My preconceived notion was blood testing is more effective. I was wrong. Now, another thing I wanted to press him on is what are the downsides to those cheaper non-WADA tests? Because we went over the exact cost, and it's $82 to $150 for the non-WADA test, whereas it's $200 to $495 for the WADA test. So on those cheaper tests, they don't do carbon isotope ratio tests within that. So what that happens is they said that they will do those cheaper tests, then if it turns out positive, then do the WADA test on that to confirm or deny it, which is a pretty interesting process. Now, to me, obviously I can't just rely on what they're saying. So what I did is I got some interesting data, is they sent past 3 years of failures by specific type of test. And what I did voluntarily on my end, I didn't tell them this, is I looked at, okay, what is the percentage of those caught by test? And how much does that reflect the test? Over the past 3 years, the USAPL has done 16% WADA tests, and the rest are all non-WADA. Now, among positive tests, the percentages are, as you can see, it's a little bit better for WADA. It catches more people on a per test basis. So are cheaper tests worse? Yes. That at least is what the answer suggests. It's important to be completely objective on that. However, it's still the majority of positives, and actually each nation is limited to a similar sized team, since you only have one lifter per nation per weight class. So the US having the absolute highest number of IPF tests each year also means there's plenty for that world team, and ultimately, these local tests matter. So essentially, they're being asked to give up 8,000 out of 10,000 tests. I think this is a hill worth dying on. Now this brings me to my final and most important point, is the USAPL has claimed that if they were to do the same amount of drug testing, but with all WADA accredited labs, that it would cost them an extra $2 million.
In order to continue testing at the rate we are, at the level we are, your right to bill would be $2 million, and we sought bids. So the only alternative for us really was that we would cut drug testing down.
But also they sent me proof, is they sent me a quota for 9 drug tests by the IPF. You know how much 9 drug tests cost? $12,480. And as you can see here, that includes a lot of fees that are hard to verify exactly how much it should cost, like personnel, transportation, all of these things that are outside of the drug tests themselves. That's something that is a very compelling case, because what that means is that this is structurally impossible to overcome. And the cost of IPF drug testing might not be reasonable, but the cost of Jack Factory protein is. Chocolate is my favorite flavor personally. Strongly recommend it. I've had chocolate or salted caramel. I would say chocolate definitely has the clear edge. By far the best tasting. And of course it just helps support your boy. Videos like this take a very long time to really nail down my opinion and hopefully give you some stats that you otherwise wouldn't think about. So it's in the description. It tastes good. And most importantly, it tastes good enough so that at night I actually have it instead of a bowl of cereal milk. And I also want to lead into the second point of parity because it also has similar structural issues. And one of those issues is that one lifter per nation can compete at Worlds. When you're dealing with what is simply the best product, that starts to matter when you're looking at talent be disproportionately towards a few countries. So with the US, for example, is it really fair that Angelo Fortino will never get to compete at IPF Worlds if he doesn't beat Russell? He would actually have a top 4 all-time 83 kilogram total in the IPF. In fact, I'll go even further. What's crazy is the top 5 83 kilogram lifters at USAPL Nationals would all beat the second best in the IPF to whichever American goes. So that means the IPF second best lifter would be 6 in USAPL Nationals. Russell won by over 110 pounds. And who is going to be that challenger to fill the place when it was John Hack versus Brett Gibbs, which was the most entertaining IPF event arguably in its history. I think a lot of us underestimated just how much Brett Gibbs was the backbone of the IPF. He's taking a break now, and nobody has filled his spot. He also was for this idea of taking the best talent regardless of nation, with no caps. And if you remove status quo bias and imagine you could create the rules out of thin air right now, I can't imagine a strong argument against this. For example, in track and field, you're able to have 3 athletes in the 100-meter dash finals. Who would voluntarily see Usain Bolt, Johan Blake, and Asafa Powell and think, I want to limit it to 1 instead? This could be possible to overcome with the USAPL, because what's interesting is they want to do an international membership, I've heard. And if they're able to do that and make the money and the situation enticing enough for international athletes like Tim Monagatti and other top talent who are incredible to come over, then you would have the best of everything, because already 2021 Nationals had the best overall top 5 average totals if you look at each weight class. Not every single weight class, but on average, it was the top. 74, 83, 93, and 105. All were the best compared to any worlds in history. So what's going to be the logical solution? If you could have exactly that, plus the top talent, now you have the best meet ever. And I think people can tell. That's the thing. You cannot fake the funk. There's nothing worse than seeing someone hit a world record and then everyone knows it's lower than a national record, but the person who has the national record just couldn't make it. And then it's like, okay. And of course, I'm speaking as a fan. Yeah, I'm not putting anything down. But I will say that if the USAPL gets rid of their camera ban and they allow everybody to record in some capacity, just have restricted areas, then I'll do nationals. I'll get back on the train. Like, that's how strongly I feel. I would love to do some media work for them or a little something, because I think this idea is just genuinely really exciting. So the third point is about scalability. And this one is another one that I think the USAPL is just doing it correctly, is they have money meets now. And it is interesting that most lifters pulled out of their money meet, their pro show, and they're trying to do more pro meets. But I think that this makes more sense in the long run than the way the IPF is doing it. So the IPF has Sheffield, which is the ultimate biggest money meet in history in drug-tested powerlifting. But it is yet to happen. And it's always very risky to make a big bet on something that hasn't happened, that there's no proof of. You know, just ask Colin Powell with WMDs in a rec. Now, you could always say, hey, the USAPL hasn't proven itself either. But I am a big believer in that consistent, smaller gradients is going to be more logical than a giant bomb. They are a little bit more inclusive as far as in upper, kind of those mid-upper level lifters can aspire to climb the ladder. And I just think that's how every successful sport does it. Even a sport like track and field that's extremely top-heavy. Even a sport like that, they have the Diamond League series. And that's a way to where even if you win high jump, you're making very real money. And I think that scalability is so important. Whereas Sheffield, I could see being this very rare bomb of huge money. And like I said, we just have no idea. We have no idea until it happens. We have no idea how the company profits, how much money they have to just keep throwing at it. Also, it just makes more sense. Doesn't it make more sense to have multiple money meets that you can see what the effect is and then decide, do you want to make it 5% bigger, 5% smaller? How can you get it accurate? The fourth point is delusion. And this is probably the biggest one. The IPF's purpose is still to get into the Olympics. It's not going to happen. Powerlifting will never be in the Olympics. Olympic weightlifting already has so many issues, even maintaining its status in the Olympics. It's had incredible problems, and I think it's relatively unlikely that the weightlifting will stay in the Olympics for the next 20 years. I think there will be a point where it just gets kicked out. And remember, the IPF still does not drug test at all, so in some countries. So there's still that problem, and they're adding in a bunch of kind of softer sports, like I believe breakdancing was just added in. And sports like that will always get in ahead of powerlifting, in my opinion, because why on earth would you want to put in a strength sport that's even more prone to steroid abuse than Olympic weightlifting when you just had problems kicking out entire countries like Russia in Olympic weightlifting? And I think they'll constantly use this as a stick and carrot to get these lifters like, hey, you're going to get to Olympics. You're almost there. You're almost there. Even though we've been saying this for 30 years, you're almost there. You're not. It'll never be there. I want to reply to some potential criticisms I could see from people who are still pro IPF. The first one is that, hey, this is WADA's rules, and it's not the IPF's control anyways. The USAPL is throwing a hissy fit over nothing. And to this I say, I don't care. I don't care if it's WADA's rules or the IPF's rules that you can't do these more economical drug tests. I think that it doesn't matter because I'm not pro-Olympics. And that line of reasoning only makes sense as if you have to answer to that hierarchy with the eventual goal of getting into the Olympics. The second point I could see is people saying, aren't you being biased towards America here? And I want to be clear, this video is not about American exceptionalism. In fact, Jack Factory is actually a Canadian-based company, and you can get their t-shirts for 50% off using the discount code Johnny right now. But also, what this video is about is the new American IPF affiliate and the problems that it will have with drug testing, in my opinion. So I'm comparing to countries like Canada, France, Italy, and the UK, simply because those are going to be the percentages that at best I think the other American affiliate will have. I would be absolutely shocked if it had a drug testing rate of over 7.5%. I suspect it'll be somewhere in the 2.5% to 6% range, which would be, at the best case scenario, a third of what the drug testing we get now. Now, another argument that I think is valid is, well, what if the data is just not being reported correctly and something's getting lost in translation for those countries with zero drug tests? I think that's possible. And I do actually think that's probably happening for at least a few countries. But is that any better? I mean, really think about what we're saying. We're saying that there's a certain incompetence and lack of transparency to the public. I don't think that's any better. Now, third point, and this is probably the most powerful one that I've received many times when researching this video, is it's not America's place to tell poorer countries that they need to drug test more. And I think that this actually crumbles when you really think about it. And I think a lot of it is misplaced empathy. So first of all, there is not a one-to-one relationship as far as financial success and drug testing within the IPF. That's why I emphasize Japan having 1 drug test, Ireland has 5 drug tests, and countries like Kazakhstan actually consistently out-drug test Japan. Not even just this year, but even in previous years. The Ukraine is another great example. The Ukraine actually has more drug tests in total than Denmark and Finland. So the biggest drug doping in history of all sports, arguably, is the Bulgarian weightlifting team. And if you look at the Bulgarian weightlifting team in the 80s, you're talking a country that has a GDP per capita actually below Algeria. And Algeria is a nation right now in the IPF that has 0 drug tests. So if you were the head of the weightlifting federation at the time, would you say, hey, we just can't drug test Bulgaria that much because in the end of the day, they have tougher conditions and that's it. Like, obviously that would not be realistic in practice because it's not that expensive to actually use PEDs. And the principles of fairness extend beyond all of this, is that if you want fair sport, then you need the same rules for everybody. And one point that I think we all do agree on is that centralized funding so that then maybe everybody gets 5% testing rather than one nation 20%, one nation 0% would be a better solution. It still wouldn't be perfect, and it would be honestly ripe for corruption, having all of that money go to one area. But it would make more sense if the goal of drug testing is fairness. Because like Clarence Kennedy pointed out in his video, it makes absolutely no sense to even drug test if there's going to be big disparities in practice in drug testing. Because then it destroys fairness, not boosts it. It's worse than untested sports. But it goes even beyond that. I want to sit down for a little story time here. Because you also have to think, who benefits more from this equation? If you have a country that doesn't drug test, they're not getting the benefits of drug-tested powerlifting. So what sense does it even make? There's no upside. You might as well have an untested federation that they can actually control fully. And who benefits on the other end from saying that they're in our federation? Of course, the IPF. So what happens is it's growing powerlifting prematurely so that you can say the IPF is both a global and drug-tested sport. That's a lie. It's not both of those at the same time. And of course, what they're pursuing is further IOC recognition, which increases potential funding, which increases power over the future of the sport. And I can tell you one thing, the person in power is not going to be you.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
Ultimately, empathy is masking incompetence on an organizational level. And it's unfortunate because then a lot of times you don't see empathy on the level that you should see it, which is on the individual level. Which brings me to my final story I want to say here. Is remember 6 years ago, Jose Castillo beat Brett Gibbs at Worlds. He's a lifter from Ecuador. He was tested positive, and then everybody reacted to that. There's a ton of dislikes on the video of him, competing. And I specifically remember Lane Norton called him an asshole online. And I remember this because I was thinking at the time, I was like, aren't you friends with Ed Cohn? Like, how is that not just a massive contradiction? And when you bring this up, what people will often say is, well, Ed Cohn's from a different time, a different setting, a different culture. Is it possible that a country like Ecuador, which has 0 drug tests in 2013 and an empty cell in 2014, is it possible that they also have a different attitude towards PEDs? And maybe Jose Castillo is not an asshole. I mean, I can say this with 100% honesty here, is that if I grew up in Ecuador and participated in Ecuador powerlifting, I don't know what my views on PEDs would be. And that's why this is so unfortunate. Because in a lot of ways, it's like you can just play, do your thing. We won't even bother to uphold a standard across the globe. But then if you win too much, you'll get destroyed. And then everybody will blame you on a moral level. And I think that's the worst of all worlds. I think you should be very critical of the organization, and you should be less critical of a person's ethics until you know more information about them. So I don't think it's the empathetic position to say these countries should just be able to go without drug testing.